Well, it's time for us to think about what happens to all these things that are produced by photosynthesis. We know that oxygen leaves the plant through the stoma, but what about the sugars? What happens to them? Well, just to review, we know that this energy change occurs between radiant and chemical, and that the chemical energy converts little molecules into bigger molecules, and that the bonds holding these bigger molecules together is where the energy is stored. So plants make all this sugar, so there should be lots of sugar stored around the plant. Well, there is, but plants also store it as a thing called starch. Now, simple sugars it's a relative term. They are simple compared to starches and other big molecules, but they are not so simple compared to things like carbon dioxide and water. Now, this is a ball and stick model you can see here showing glucose, and we can see it's got a big ring structure in the middle over here, and it's got some bits hanging off, and then it tells us that the white things are hydrogen, the green things are carbon, and these other ones are oxygen. And so we can see these are things, and we can also see these lines are the bonds holding them together. Right, effectively we can think of these as being energy. Now, if we count the number of bonds holding this together, 1, 2, etc., 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 we see there are lots of them. And that means that energy is increased by having these number of bonds. So I wonder what would happen if we could join some of these glucose. Here's a glucose again. It's the same thing but a bit different. So if we joined several of them together. Now when we do this sort of things, we give it a special name. When we join little molecules together, we call it a polymer. Monomers are the little things, and they join together to make a big thing called a polymer. Now, starch is an example of a polymer that is made from all these simple little sugars joined together. Now, when you see the N value here, it means there is a big number of them. Instead of putting down 10, 20, 50, or whatever, we put down these N's, which talk about multiple lots there, all right? Now, it's important to remember that now we're getting more and more bonds. We are storing more and more energy. This, down the bottom, is a version of what we know starch is. And it's this pattern repeated. And that's the thing about a polymer. A polymer simply repeats a pattern. So we pack glucose in a certain way, or we pack these simple sugars together in a certain way, and then repeat it over and over and over again, and we produce starch. Right, now the important thing with this is we've got all this energy joined together. What use is it to us? Well, we eat plants, and as you know, we basically go through some of the background we have is we've got carbos, proteins, and we've got fats and lipids and oils. Now, each one of these, for us to be useful to us, we've got to break them back apart. And these colourful things here, which have got names, are chemicals which help us break the bonds so that all the little things can become again. Now, one of the typical things we see up here is these chemicals end with the ASE, and quite a few of them. Now, I'm going to stay with we know that, say, something like bread or biscuits comes from flour, and flour is quite high in starch. But if we want to make it a sweet thing and release the sugars so we can absorb them from our food, we attack it with a chemical called an amylase. It's AMYLASE. And that basically cuts it back apart, cuts the bonds apart, and we end up with the little sugars. Now, similar things happen for when we want to break proteins into amino acids, or we want to make fats and oils into fatty acids and glycerol. We use these special chemicals called enzymes. Now, each enzyme is responsible for one particular reaction only. Alright, so if we want to break a certain type of carbo into simple sugars, we use a particular enzyme. More about that later. That'll do us today.